Here today, we're standing at the grave of my father, Berthold Halfpap, a man who immigrated from Germany when he was 17 years old and who ran a grocery store here in Fort Dodge at 214 South 19th Street, to be exact. There is no grocery store there now. It looks to be a garage, and it's about a block south of Kimmy's Photography, if anyone wants to drive by. The story I'm going to tell you, though, today is not about my father. It's about the man who murdered him when my father was 55 years old. That man was Bill Olander, and I want to tell you about that man and how he was brought to justice. Bill Olander was born in Boxholm in 1896 and had a reputation as a bad boy from a very young age. A Boxholm resident who knew him as a teenager said he was one mean SOB. His first brush with the documented brush with the law happened when he was 16 years old and stole a flashlight from a hardware store. He was sentenced to 2 years at the school for boys in Eldora, which leads some to believe that it was the first documented but not the first actual brush with the law. When he got out at age 18, he got married to his wife Daisy, with whom he'd proceed to have 3 children. And he went on to commit additional crimes, bootlegging alcohol, amongst others. In 1918, upon being convicted for a crime, the judge said, you have a choice. You can go to jail again, or you can join what? What was going on in 1918? World War I. He joined the Army, and that's what he picked. And he was in the Army for just under 11 months, had a clean record, and was honorably discharged. After that discharge, though, he pretty quickly went back to his old ways. He moved his family to Fort Dodge in the fall of 1919 and to work at the gypsum mines. In the July of 1920, in the midst of a strike, he was unemployed, and there were lots of strikes that had been going on that year. There had been a lot of disputes about fair wages. And it was during one of those times that Bill Olander and his gang, he had a gang of about 4 men, young men, who decided to begin a crime spree in Fort Dodge. Over the next 9 months, they committed 8 to 9 robberies, amongst other crimes. And actually, when we say 9 months, we probably should say 7, because 2 of those months he was in jail again. The last crime he committed, however, was the crime that involved my father. On March 12th, 1921, my father was closing up the grocery store at about 9:40. He had counted the cash receipts for the day. He'd written a check that he was going to give to our minister the next morning at church when two men entered the grocery store. Bill Olander and his buddy by the last name of Goebel. Sweeney, another gang member, was out in the car. They came in, they asked for cigars, and my father handed them a box of cigars. And at that point, Olander said, "Hands up," and demanded the cash. Now, my father was a little feisty, and he hadn't seen a weapon, so he assumed they were amateurs and they were bluffing. So he proceeded to throw the cigar box at Olander's head. He then proceeded to grab a hatchet and throw that at Olander's head. My dad was feisty, but not a particularly good shot. Olander jumped over the counter, grabbed my father by the neck, and shot him at point-blank range, just above his heart. They ran from the store. My father staggered after them and yelled, "Murder!" out the front door of the grocery store. I was at home, a few doors down, heard a loud noise, and heard a scream. So I ran to the grocery store, where I was the first one on the scene to find my father trying to call for help on the telephone. He crumbled to the ground, and I ended up calling for help. The next day, he did come to enough to give a clear statement to police that was very helpful as they found the perpetrators, but he died later that day. His injuries were just too severe to overcome. Olander and the boys laid low for about 3 weeks. The city council even offered a reward, a $500 reward for anyone who had information that could lead to their arrest. Olander and Sweeney, the car driver, were the first 2 found and arrested, and they were held at $10,000 bond each, which at the time was quite high. Goebel was arrested soon after, and relatively quickly, Goebel and Sweeney turned state evidence and confessed, fingering Olander as the trigger man. He then confessed too, sobbed and cried, and pleaded that his life be spared. He also confessed to all of the crimes he had, and detailed all of the crimes he had committed since his discharge from the Army. Now, his attorneys had a decision to make. With the confession, the only issue was the sentence. Would he be sentenced to death, or would he be sentenced to life in prison? And his attorneys felt that it was better to put his fate in the hands of one man, a judge, than in 12 of his peers or the community members, a jury. So his attorneys, Robert Healy, and Morris Breen, his assistant, took him before Judge Thompson for sentencing. Judge Thompson found that he would hang by his neck until he was dead. That's when Healy and Breen began the fight for Bill Olander's life. They first appealed to the Iowa State Supreme Court, asking that the sentence be commuted to life in prison. The Iowa Supreme Court denied that, with one dissenter who believed the men should have been treated equally. Justice Silas Weaver felt they should have been treated equally. Then the attorneys appealed to the United States Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Taft issued the majority opinion, again affirming the sentence. Their third appeal was to the United States District Court in Iowa, where they asked for a writ of habeas corpus and a finding that he was being held on death row unlawfully. That was denied. All of this time he was on death row at Fort Madison. He'd been shackled and taken down by train immediately after the sentencing hearing. Their last-ditch effort was to ask the governor, then Governor Kendall, to commute the sentence. He refused as well. The litigation that took place in this murder trial set a record for murder trial litigation at that time in Iowa. And Olander had no money. He was being represented by court-appointed attorneys. So the state of Iowa and its taxpayers paid for this long defense. His accomplices, by the way, if I didn't say so already, received life in prison. And they had been tried by a jury. So then things kind of got a little hectic. The hanging date was scheduled for September 7th, 1923, and much had to be done. A scaffold had to be built. A scaffold was built for each hanging, built immediately prior and then torn down immediately after, because they weren't that common in Iowa. The execution party had to travel from Fort Dodge down to Fort Madison, and there were certain people that had to be present, this execution party being the witnesses to the hanging. The judge who sentenced him had to be present. The sheriff from Webster County had to actually open the trap door to initiate the hanging. The clerk of court had to be present, the county attorney, and 2 physicians. Then there were 12 other appointed witnesses that the sheriff appointed, and he at the time said there were over 100 men who expressed interest in being appointed for this hanging. He picked 12, one of which was my younger brother, Bert Jr. The day before the hanging, Bill Olander spent his time meeting with his minister. He wrote a statement to be published in the Boone newspaper, where he maintained he had not committed premeditated murder and that he did not deserve to hang. His last meal, he was able to request last meal, and he requested fried eggs, bananas, and oranges. He went to bed at 11 that night and woke up the next morning at 3:30 in the morning, again to spend time with his minister and to write a letter to his mother. At 7:30, his arms were bound to his sides, and a specially calibrated rope was put over his neck. Bill Olander was a small man. He was 5'3" and weighed 132 pounds. So the rope had to be just right in order to break his neck quickly and painlessly, which it did. It took 14 minutes for his heart to stop beating. The doctors had to check 3 times to confirm that he was dead. Bill Olander was 26 years old. He was the first man to be sentenced to death in Webster County. He was the only man from Boxholm to ever be hung. And he was the 23rd man to be executed in the state of Iowa. The most important fact to me, however, was that the man who killed my father had been brought to justice. Thank you so much for your time.